Uhuru, and welcome to this very important web event tonight, sponsored by the African People's Solidarity Committee and the Uhuru Solidarity Movement. My name is Penny HESS.
I'm Jesse NEVEL.
We are members of the African People's Solidarity Committee, and that's the organization of white people working under the leadership of the African People's Socialist Party. Our job, our task is to go into the white community, into the belly of the beast, organize other white people just like ourselves to take a stand in solidarity with the right of African people everywhere to liberation, to reparations, to unifying Africa and African people under the leadership of the African working class for justice and for a history, a future in which all human beings can live in a world of peace in which no one lives at the expense of anybody else. We are working for reparations to African people, and we're broadcasting from this beautiful Aquaba Hall here in St. Petersburg, Florida, at the Uhuru House, which is the headquarters of the African People's Socialist Party tonight. And we have a very, very serious subject to talk about, and that is this public stance and program of the FBI and the US government targeting African organizations inside the borders of the United States that would be working for political and economic control over their lives and communities. They're targeted as under the label Black Identity Extremists, and it is an excuse to resume the COINTELPRO attacks of the 1960s and 70s that murdered, assassinated leaders of the Black Revolution of the 1960s, imprisoned activists and leaders of that movement, some of whom are still in prison today, such as Sundiata Acoli and others. Assata Shakur is in exile still today because of the attacks of that period. It's a continuation of this COINTELPRO. And tonight we're calling on white people to take a stand to defend the African community and its right to struggle for liberation. People are being targeted, Africans are being targeted if they use the word black. Yep. That makes them fall under Black Identity Extremists. And if they fight for self-determination programs in the African community, which has been, living under colonial conditions of extreme poverty and oppression. And we want to take this on as the white community, and we are going to lay out what this means, what this attack means by the FBI. And we believe that if you believe that reparations are owed to African people, or you believe that you must take a stand against the oppression of African people historically and today, and against what we define as colonialism, the political and economic control of the African community. And if you just believe that we can't go forward without rectifying our relationship to the Black community, that we must have a principled stance that rectifies our history of attacks and violence against African people in this country and around the world, then we want you to join us tonight and to look at what this attack means, what it is that we must do in our relationship to it. So, Jesse?
Uhuru. Well, I just want to say I'm very honored to be here with you, Chairwoman Penny HESS, and as you stated, I am a member of the African People's Solidarity Committee, and I'm also the chair of our mass organization, the Uhuru Solidarity Movement, which, as you said, works under the leadership of the African People's Socialist Party to go into the white community and organize white people to stand in solidarity with Black liberation, to stand in solidarity with African self-determination, and that is carried out through reparations to African people, unleashing the stolen resources in the white community that have come at the expense of the 600-year legacy of slavery and colonialism that continues to this day. So it's very important for all of the members and supporters of the Solidarity Movement to know about this FBI attack, because we have a responsibility as white people to refuse to be complicit with the FBI's latest program to to undermine and ultimately to attempt to destroy the Black revolution that is reemerging inside this country. So we actually have here the document.
Yes.
This is the document that was leaked to Foreign Policy magazine. Sharon Weinberg, I think was her name, the woman who published it.
Can we show them, can we show people what it looks like? I don't know if they can see it. No. Kyle says no, we can't.
I don't know if you can see that. There you
Okay,
go.
they can't.
Well, you can find it if you go to Foreign Policy. They put a link to
Yeah.
it, and it's labeled "Black Identity Extremists, likely motivated to target law enforcement," and they later define likely motivated as meaning that if somebody is gripped by Black identity extremist ideology, that there's a 55 to 80% chance that they're going to kill a cop. Interesting. So this was published by the Federal Bureau of Investigation and prepared by the FBI Counter-Terrorism Division. So they're labeling so-called Black identity extremists as a potential, quote, terrorist threat, which, as we know in this country, that whenever oppressed people fight back against oppression, they're terrorists. In fact, the Uhuru movement was called terrorist right here in St. Pete by the police chief, or by the what's the guy's name? The leader of the police union,
George Lofton.
George Lofton, when we were running a campaign under the leadership of the party here. So it's no different from that. Yeah, an election here in St. Petersburg. All right, so here's the document. Black identity extremists likely motivated to target law enforcement officers. And it reads that the FBI assesses it is very likely Black identity extremist perceptions of police brutality against African Americans, quote unquote.
Can we stop right there?
Yes.
Perceptions?
Perceptions.
Like
the reality.
people being murdered, their bodies on the ground, that's a perception.
Exactly. The perception.
And every 18 hours in this country,
Right.
another African is murdered by police.
Right. That's not a perception. That's cold, hard fact. So it goes on to say that the perceptions of police brutality against African people, African Americans as they call it, spurred an increase in premeditated, retaliatory, lethal violence against law enforcement and will very likely serve as justification for such violence. That's kind of interesting too, because on the one hand it says it's premeditated, on the other hand it acknowledges that it's retaliation. So, okay. The FBI assessed it is very likely this increase began following the August 9th, 2014 shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, and the subsequent grand jury November 2014 declination to indict the police officers involved. The FBI assesses it is very likely incidents of alleged police abuse against African Americans since then have continued to feed the resurgence in ideologically motivated violent criminal activity within the Black identity extremist movement. The FBI assesses it is very likely some BIEs, quote unquote, are influenced by a mix of anti-authoritarian Moorish sovereign citizen ideology and BIE ideology. The FBI has high confidence in these assessments based on the history of violent incidents attributed to individuals who acted on behalf of their ideological beliefs, documented in FBI investigations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, now, one of the most revealing sections of this document is actually a footnote that next to the term, the first appearance of the term Black identity extremist, it takes you down to a footnote where they define what they mean by Black identity extremists. The FBI defines Black identity extremists as individuals who seek, wholly or in part, through unlawful acts of force or violence, as opposed to lawful acts of force or violence, such as those carried out by the U.S. government every single day, in response to perceived racism and injustice in American society, and some do so in furtherance of establishing a separate Black homeland or autonomous Black social institutions, communities, or governing organizations within the United States. This desire for physical or psychological separation is typically based on either a religious or political belief system, which is sometimes formed around or includes a belief in racial superiority or supremacy. The mere advocacy of political or social positions, political activism, use of strong rhetoric, or generalized philosophic embrace of violent tactics may not constitute extremism, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot there. They are criminalizing the mere desire for African self-determination on the part of the oppressed and colonized African population inside U.S. borders. By saying Black autonomous social institutions, we are hosting this broadcast from within the walls of a Black autonomous social institution. So that makes everybody in this room Black identity extremists. And that makes everybody watching this a Black identity extremist, according to their definition. This is clearly an attempt to attack and, again, to criminalize the just right of African people to have self-determination and control over their lives. And it's not even that masked. It's pretty explicit. They even say the desire for psychological separation is worthy of being labeled a Black identity extremist. So it later goes on to talk about 6 different cases where African people in the United States fought back against the colonial police occupation of their communities. And in these cases, unlike what happens every 18 hours, as you mentioned, where a cop murders an African person, in this case, the gun was turned in the other direction in an act of resistance, and the cop ended up dying. And these 6 incidents are given as evidence of the rise of so-called Black identity extremism. And it also says repeatedly that grievances with police violence against African people are the primary factor leading to, quote, violent targeting of law enforcement. So there are 2 very key issues that are made explicit in this document. One is the question of self-determination and the question of identity. And it just says so much about the American social system and about parasitic capitalism that the basic reality of African people, even identifying themselves as Black, shatters the whole status quo, shatters the standard operating of a social system that's built on denying African people any semblance of an identity. And then to take it even further and to say that African people struggling for some kind of autonomy, some kind of independence, clearly that's the most dangerous thing to a social system that is built on denying African people, on robbing African people of their independence and their self-determination. And one other thing, I know that, Penny, you're going to be talking about what happened in the 60s, and one of the things that's very revealing in this document is that they are basically saying that what happened in the 60s, that they're planning to do that again. Because it says here, and they're already doing it, because it says here that the last time the FBI had to deal with, quote, Black identity extremists was in the 60s and in the 70s. And they even name organizations like the Black Liberation Army, that was an organization that fought back against police violence and fought back against colonialism. They said that was the last time the FBI, so at the time, they called those groups Black nationalist hate groups. They're retroactively labeling them Black identity extremists to say, last time we had this problem, it was dealt with in the form of assassination and in the form of horrific counterinsurgency. So they're basically issuing a threat themselves to say, this is what's going to happen again. And that's why it's so important for this event to be happening and for this to be exposed, because white people are not going to be complicit in this time around like we were in the 1960s. And we're going to talk about that. So the other quick thing is the issue of violence that this keeps bringing up. And I just think the term unlawful acts of violence is so revealing, because nothing is more violent than the United States government. And obviously, they don't have an issue with violence. They have an issue with anything that challenges their monopoly on violence. And clearly, it is not the same, the violence of the oppressor, the violence that is inherent to the social system, that it requires African people to live in a constant state of desperation and humiliation and poverty, that very reality is violence, that cannot be equated morally, politically, on any level to an act of resistance on the part of colonized people. And regardless of whether or not it's politically or ideologically motivated, that it's not the same thing, that as the Chairman Omali Yeshitela has said, any act of aggression by an oppressed people against their oppressor is an act of self-defense.
Right.
And white people have to say that too, and have to unite with that, and have to defend the right of African people to resist, the right of African people to defend their communities and to defend their ability to live. Uhuru.
Uhuru, thank you, Jesse. And I mean, I just really want to say, first of all, that The African People's Socialist Party is the vanguard. That is the theme for the party's 7th Congress, which is going to be held in St. Louis, Missouri in October of this year, actually, of 2018. The Congress of the African People's Socialist Party, when all the membership comes together to vote in their plans, their program, put out by Chairman Omali Shatella for the upcoming 5-year period. It's their 5-year plan. And that the African People's Socialist Party is very serious about African workers gaining power, the power to govern. They are not just about a demonstration, although they've had many over the years against every form of colonial violence and oppression manifested against the African community all over this country and in Europe and throughout Africa. But they are building their own dual and contending power as the basis for waging the African Revolution. And I just want to say that one of the things that we want to ask white people to do is to give reparations, is to turn over resources to the African Revolution, not to an individual, but to an organization that is fighting for the liberation of African people inside the United States and all over the world. And which has a strategy to win and free African people and to bring self-determination and liberation, and has always stood in solidarity with indigenous people, Mexican workers, the indigenous people, the Palestinian people, and all oppressed and colonized peoples every place in the world. This has been the internationalism of the African People's Socialist Party. And this must be defended. So you can go to APSP Uhuru, that's APSPUhuru.org/donate. We want to raise $1,000 tonight for the programs of the African People's Socialist Party, including Black Star Industries, which is their economic front for self-determination, of which the program in St. Louis going on right now called Black Power Blueprint, building an Uhuru house there, taking over and buying abandoned buildings in the African community and just bringing life to this, building a Jico kitchen and other kinds of programs to bring economic self-determination to the African community. It's a beautiful, exciting program that is attacked by this program of the Black Identity Extremists. So please go to apspuhuru.org/donate to give to the African People's Socialist Party and Black Star Industries tonight. And I just wanted to say that under Trump, I've heard, as this election was unfolding and Trump came into power and is still there, you hear a lot of white organizations talking about this question of fascism, that white people are afraid of fascism. But this has been going on against the African community since day one. I mean, it began with the assault on Africa. It began with turning African people into commodities as the basis for this parasitic capitalist system. That's how it was born. It began with genocide. It began with kidnapping African people and enslaving them and putting them on ships, working them to death in this hemisphere, in the Caribbean, in the US, and Brazil. Hundreds and millions of African people. This is what built the wealth of the society of capitalism, the social system that we benefit from, that we live and sit on the pedestal of. And it's also built on the genocide of the indigenous people, the theft of their land, and on the colonial domination of the majority of planet Earth. That's how Europe and US got to be rich, got to be powerful, got to own an empire upon which the sun never sets even today because of the domination militarily, politically, and economically of the majority of the people on the planet Earth. And you heard the statements that Trump just made in the last few days about Africans, about the people, Africans from Haiti, Africans from Africa, that's how the U.S. got rich, by attacking and assaulting Africans in Africa, in Haiti, overturning their brilliant revolution in 1804 in which African workers had power. And this is the basis for the US government, for there to be white power. This is the political and economic basis of that. And all through the early 2000 or the early 20th century, up until and through the 1960s, as the chairman says, revolution was the main trend in the whole world, all around the world. Just think about it. There was Che Guevara, there was Ho Chi Minh, there was Mao Zedong, there was Fidel Castro, there was, there was Biko from the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania. There were leaders everywhere. There was Patrice Lumumba, there was Kwame Nkrumah fighting for the liberation and unification of Africa and oppressed and colonized peoples around the world. And there was this sense of hope and optimism that people of the world had, including white people, because we could see a future that would be possible without being the oppressor nation, which we are, sitting on the pedestal of the oppression of African people. And that the US's response to that was one of counterinsurgency, which means a US military assault against all African, Vietnamese, oppressed and colonized peoples struggling for their control of their land, their resources, and their people. The US lashed out and created a counterinsurgency program that affected, all the struggling peoples on the planet Earth. And one of them, inside the borders of the United States, was called COINTELPRO. It was a program against the Black Revolution of the 60s, the Black Power movement, the ability of African people to struggle for their freedom and liberation, which just ignited the 60s inside this country and politicized so many from the white community. But we never stood on the side of African people as their leaders were being gunned down, were being murdered right in front of the view of everybody else. And I think it was in the early 1970s, there was a struggle that found these COINTELPRO papers in, I think it was in Pennsylvania, when some of the offices of the FBI were raided by some activists then, and they found these COINTELPRO papers, these secret papers of the FBI that were published in 1967, the height of the Black Revolution and the beginning of it, when it was, when it was so new and so powerful, when the Black Panther Party was growing and becoming the revolutionary center inside the borders of the United States. And these papers read, they said that the purpose of this new counterintelligence endeavor, which is what COINTELPRO stands for, counterintelligence program, it said this endeavor is to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, and otherwise neutralize, which of course means murder, as we know, the activists of the Black nationalist hate-type organizations and groupings, their leadership, spokesmen, memberships, and supporters, and to counter their propensity for violence and civil disorder. After 400 years of violence, 600 years of violence against the African community, the worst kind of lynchings, murder, rape, slaughter, enslavement, beatings, forced labor, all of the things that had been imposed upon the African community that they had a right to resist and fight back. And this is a program to, and by the way, there was tremendous support from the white population for the Black Revolution of the 60s, for the Black Panther Party, throughout the white population. But when this brutal program was launched and we started to see the murder of Malcolm X, which was actually 2 years before this document, but of course it was going on, of Martin Luther King, who was clearly targeted and mentioned in these documents, and Fred Hampton and so many others who were murdered by the US government. we saw no response whatsoever from the white population. In fact, what we saw was white people leaving the movement in droves, running out to live in communes in the country and go to Woodstock and turn on, tune in, whatever it was, and drop out, as they said of that period, you know, just abandoning any responsibility that we had to, you know, to stand in solidarity with the African liberation movement. And I just wanted to say also that the COINTELPRO had goals, and those goals said, prevent the coalition of militant black nationalist groups. In unity there is strength, a truism that is no less valid for all its triteness. An effective coalition of black nationalist groups might be the first step toward a real Mau Mau black revolutionary army in America, the beginning of a true black revolution. And this was in a period when they did a poll, I think Reuters or something, and a huge percentage of just randomly selected African population inside the borders of the United States said that they identified as revolutionary. So, you know, it was an incredible period. The goals of the COINTELPRO also said to prevent the rise of a messiah, quote unquote, who could unify and electrify the militant black nationalist movement. It says Malcolm X might have been such a messiah. He is the martyr of the movement today. Martin Luther King, Stokely Carmichael, and Elijah Muhammad all aspire to this position. And it says Elijah Muhammad is less of a threat because of his age. King could be a very real contender for this position should he abandon his supposed, quote, obedience to white liberal doctrines, nonviolence, and embrace black nationalism. Carmichael has the necessary charisma to be a real threat in this way. And just to say that Martin Luther King, as people may know, was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, going beyond just the, you know, the label of nonviolence, because he was at a workers' strike, the sanitation workers' strike in Memphis, Tennessee, going beyond his kind of protest that he had been doing. And he was also assassinated 1 year to a day, and the US government likes to give these messages and do this in this way. 1 year to the day where he had spoken at Riverside Church in New York, in New York City, saying that as violent as the US is in Vietnam, that he can no longer uphold his stance of nonviolence against the U.S. government. So a message was given to him, to the, you know, to his supporters and African people in that. And another goal of COINTELPRO was to prevent the violence on part of the black nationalist groups. Quote unquote, this is of primary importance and is of course a goal of our investigative activity. And of course, in fact, you know, I mean, it was COINTELPRO that incited violence between the groups and incited all kinds of things and sent in agents. And it said, prevent militant black nationalist groups and leaders from gaining respectability by discrediting them to three separate segments of the community, et cetera. And also, the final goal should be to prevent the long-range growth of militant black organizations, especially among the youth. So these are insidious tactics that clearly targeted. And, you know, there's a lot of people like, well, did the U.S. government really murder them? Of course they did. This is a government built on murdering hundreds of millions of people, attacking and assaulting Africans, and, you know, it's built on the enslavement of African people, the genocide of the indigenous people, and the colonization of the peoples on the planet Earth. So, you know, this is a very, very serious question that we as white people need to come together and take a stand to become a buffer between the U.S. government's attacks against the African population, you know, between the African organizations and the U.S. government. And I just really want to thank Bobby Wittenberg, who gave reparations of $100 tonight. Uhuru, wow, Uhuru, Bobby. A powerful veteran of the Iraq War, whom we know, who has taken an incredible stand in solidarity with Iraqi people, African people, and people on the planet Earth. So, we really appreciate that. Again, you can go to apspuhuru.org/donate. We want to raise $1,000 tonight. We want to do this as a stand of reparations to the African community from white people who sit on the pedestal, whose every dream and aspiration has come at the expense of African people and oppressed people on the planet. Uhuru.
Uhuru.
So, Jesse? So,
Okay.
Where are we here? We were talking about,
I think there's a little bit more about.
so do you want to go over that?
Sure, okay. So just to continue what Chairwoman Penny Hess was talking about in terms of some of the tactics that were used by the FBI in targeting the Black Power movement in the 60s. And again, the reason why this is important to understand is because this is what they are gearing up to do again. And this is what white people did not come out and do anything to stop in the 1960s. So it's important to learn from what happened in the 1960s so we understand how we have to move this time around. And as Chairwoman Penny Hess was laying out, we have a document here that lays out some of the tactics that were used. It included infiltration, agents and informers that did not merely spy on political activists, but came in to discredit and disrupt them. Their very presence served to undermine trust and scare off potential supporters. The police and FBI exploited this fear to smear genuine activists as agents. Number 2, psychological warfare. The FBI and the police used myriad dirty tricks to undermine progressive movements. They planted false media stories and published bogus leaflets and other publications in the name of targeted groups. And they still do this. There have been fake Uhuru movement accounts that have been created by obvious police agents. They forged correspondence, sent anonymous letters, and made anonymous telephone calls. Sounds very familiar. They spread misinformation about meetings and events. Well, this is chillingly familiar to one particular incident. Set up pseudo-movement groups run by government agents and manipulated or strong-armed parents, employers, landlords, school officials, and others to cause trouble for activists. They used bad jacketing to create suspicion about targeted activists, sometimes with lethal consequences. 3, harassment via the legal system. The FBI and police abused the legal system to harass dissidents and make them appear to be criminals. Officers of the law gave perjured testimony and presented fabricated evidence as a pretext for false arrests and wrongful imprisonment, and used conspicuous surveillance, investigative interviews, and grand jury subpoenas in an effort to intimidate activists and silence their supporters. And then, of course, most notoriously, illegal force. The FBI conspired with local police departments to threaten dissidents to conduct illegal break-ins, in which the term illegal, as the chairman says, the state legalizes itself. Slavery was legal.
Right.
To commit vandalism, assaults, beatings, and assassinations, such as the assassination of Fred Hampton, where they drugged him, the 21-year-old, was it 21? 21-year-old leader of the Black Panther Party in Chicago, who was drugged while he slept in bed next to his pregnant wife. And the police and FBI busted in and shot him multiple times, and then shot him again to make sure he was dead while he slept in bed.
Pulled him out of the bed where they had drugged him, like he said. He had Kool-Aid, and an agent put drugs in the Kool-Aid so he couldn't wake up. And then the police dragged him out of the bed, put him in the doorway, and there's a famous picture of that, of him laying down. And they said, they shot him point blank in the back, as you're saying, and said he's good and dead now. Right. And, just brutally, this young man who had the courage to stand up at such a young age, to see, the youth, and we see this in the African People's Socialist Party today, the young people that are part of this movement, of the Uhuru movement, fighting for the liberation of African people everywhere. This is, and we stood by, white people stood by while this happened to Fred Hampton. It was well known, it was on TV, it was known. In fact, they had hundreds and even thousands of people. They opened up the house where he was murdered, and people came by, mostly African people. White people did nothing. There were no demonstrations in support of the Black Panther Party and denouncing what happened to Fred Hampton at that time. white people just stood by and went back up on the pedestal of the oppression. That's what we did. And this is not going to happen again. This is not going to happen again. From the African People's Solidarity Committee, we are determined to build a movement of white people who will take a stand in solidarity with African people. And I just want to say that this building right here, this beautiful Uhuru House, was attacked and assaulted in 1996 after the police murder of Tyrone Lewis just 3 blocks down the street, who was 18 years old. There were uprisings in the African community, very politicized uprisings in 1996. What was that? Like 20 years before Ferguson. Uprisings that targeted not African-owned stores or anything like that, but targeted, the media, the police, the visible vestiges of all of them, all of the forces that oppress African people every single day. And the Uhuru movement, and Chairman Omali Shatella came out as, was upheld as basically the people's mayor of St. Petersburg, of the African community of that time. And this building right here, it was such a powerful movement that this building was designated by the police, forced to be designated by the police in the city, to be treated as an embassy, that anybody who came into this building would not be arrested and could not be arrested. And, it had a sanctuary to it that was really powerful, that was indicative of the dual and contending power that the African working class had won. And in 3 weeks after the murder of Tyrone Lewis, the grand jury ruled that the 2 killer cops would be exonerated. They would not be indicted. They would not be charged with anything. And so that night, that very night, there was a regularly scheduled meeting of the International People's Democratic Uhuru Movement, and 300 highly armed police department officers, whatever, agents, pigs, surrounded this building. And it was from police organizations and SWAT teams and all of that kind of thing from all over the state, actually. And they unleashed onto this building the entire stock of tear gas in the entire city. Just imagine that, being in this building. There were about 100 people in this building, including children, including elderly, families, all kinds of people, from the African working class who were coming out to show their anger at this stance of the state to not indict, to do nothing once again against the killer cops. And here, they're in a meeting in every way, a meeting that's advertised publicly and held every single week at that time. And all of a sudden you can't see anything. It's covered with smoke. You can't breathe. Your eyes are tearing up. People are getting asthma attacks. People thought they were going to die, and it was intended to murder the African community at that time. And the police started setting trees around the building on fire, hoping that it would drop onto the roof. And the people outside kept putting it out, and the people fought back outside and took on and made the police go away. But even at that time, the white left, and even ourselves as APSC, we did not do what we needed to do to really galvanize the white community to take that on. And this is never going to happen again. We are standing as, in front, in the trenches, in solidarity with African people. This kind of attack is not going to happen, not in our name. And I really appreciate all of the people who are paying reparations and putting resources towards the African People's Socialist Party, apspohuru.org/donate tonight. Janice Cant, $50. Uhuru. Kitty Riley, $30.
Uhuru.
Star, $30. Ann Hirsch, $50. Johan Bedingfield, $50. Total $335.
All right.
Uhuru. Yeah, and I want to say that I am going to put in $50 tonight, so I want to add to that as reparations to the African community, and that would put us at $385. So, you know, we just have a little bit more than $600 to raise because, you know, because the African People's Socialist Party is funded only through political support from the African community and reparations from the white community. And so it has its integrity. It has the ability to never be compromised in its stand, in its unfailing support, you know, unity with the fact that African working class must lead their own struggle, and that the values and the what would we call it, revolutionary morality of the liberation of African working class people will be at the center of this African revolution no matter what. It will not be sold out. And that is because that you give your resources, you turn over and give reparations to African people as genuine unity and solidarity with African internationalism and the work of the African People's Socialist Party.
Penny, I just wanted to say, when you were talking about the chairman and that whole period in 1996 and the period after that, and how the chairman was regarded as the people's mayor, and it just made me think about the fact that when Chairman Omali Yeshitela, the leader of the African People's Socialist Party, ran for mayor in this city, he won every single black precinct in the city. So the whole way the election system is set up is to make it impossible for the African vote to make any real difference and for them to have any real democratic power. But if African people had a separate government and their own independent black autonomous social and governing institution, they would have had Chairman Omali Yeshitela as their mayor. So that just shows you African people want their freedom, and that's what this Black Identity Extremist document is criminalizing, is the desire of African people for their freedom.
Exactly that. I mean, yeah, so we have to, you know, we have to take that on. We have to really internalize what that means. And, you know, when we talk about fears of fascism, et cetera, fascism is here, and it's called colonialism, and it exists inside the borders of the United States, and this is the reality that the majority of the people on the planet Earth are forced to live under every day. We're the only ones that have democratic rights, and you know, the white population of the world. And you know, I just want to say something about this whole question of counterinsurgency as well, because you know, all throughout the 50s, the 1950s and the 1960s, the struggle of African people was known around the world, and people were aware of the lynchings, the Jim Crow, and convict leasing, and the enslavement of African people, and what African people had been through and still continue to exist under in this country, but how African people struggling just for the right to vote, just for basic democratic rights under the system, had gone up against police dogs, the dogs of the sheriffs, fire hoses, and saw the murders of little girls in churches, and you know, people like Emmett Till being murdered, and activists in the summer project of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and just so much violence trained against it every single day. But the struggle of African people was the moral compass of the whole world. It inspired the Vietnamese, it inspired revolutionary peoples around the world to have the courage to struggle against the leading power of U.S. imperialism with the largest, most deadly army in the entire U.S., because they knew, the Vietnamese knew, for one, and many others, that the U.S. had to fight them and who had to fight inside the borders of the U.S. as well, where rebellions and really guerrilla warfare was going on in places like Detroit. And the U.S. government unleashed COINTELPRO, as we talked about what this meant, the murdering of people whose integrity was of the highest in this country, who gave their lives for the struggle of their people to be free, to be able to live, to be happy, to be able to have their own culture and self-determination. But not only did the U.S. government carry out those goals that you just read of COINTELPRO, but also it is a well-known and documented fact that the U.S. government imposed heroin and crack cocaine onto the African community in a way to salt the earth, to be able, and went along with that not just the drugs, but as the chairman defines it, a drug economy.
Yes.
By removing what they called urban removal or
Yes.
urban removal, African removal, as the party called it, back in the 60s, out of the African communities and putting in freeways, as they did right here, or Tropicana Dome,
Yep.
and to be able to destroy, as Tropicana did, hundreds and hundreds of businesses and houses and and a whole community in which there were grocery stores and gas stations and movie theaters, all of this kind of thing owned by the African community, wiped it out. So African people no longer had an economy that could benefit them whatsoever. And African people in the Black communities all over the country were basically in deep starvation. So in this situation, the US government unleashes and imposes heroin and crack cocaine onto those communities with no other livelihood to put food on the table.
Yep.
That people were forced into basically a colonial commodity, to be able to feed their families. And that's what happened. And they used that to criminalize what had been a few years before the highest moral upheld, community in the entire world in this struggle. And, and then criminalize that community as the criminals, as the drug dealers, when in fact the U.S. government was. And I want to say that, if you haven't read Gary Webb's Dark Alliance, or if you haven't seen all of the Iran-Contra hearings, this is something that has, this is public. This is on public record. This is what they did, and they began to criminalize everything that African people did, making designer laws like 3 strikes you're out, which targeted the African community, giving Africans 500 times the time served or sentencing for crack cocaine than for powder cocaine, which was more in the white community. Just beginning to round up and basically put into these gulags called prisons inside the borders of the United States, building the largest prison population in the entire world, which, by the way, was an economic boom for white communities everywhere, all around this country, and still is today, because that period of the 1970s, the Vietnam War had drained the U.S. of any kind of viable economy. It was in a state of collapse, as it is now, and that it was this prison economy that benefited white people at the expense of African people. That imposed drugs, the war on drugs, the prison economy, the criminalization, and this intensification of armed police forces, SWAT teams, helicopters, police dogs, breaking down people's doors, the violation of every possible democratic and political right that the African population, ever struggled for and died for, were taken away in that. I just want to really thank David Pudlow for $40 tonight. It was really powerful as a stand of reparations towards African people, giving it directly to the African People's Socialist Party at apspuhuru.org/donate. And also from Jesse McCall out in Seattle, Washington. Really appreciate that. $30 tonight. Uhuru.
Right.
We're at $455. We're almost to halfway our goal. I'd like to bring up Jackson Hollingsworth, who's going to join us and talking to people. We also want to know that we have a wonderful studio audience here tonight. We have $50 from Allison Haney, so that puts us at $500 tonight. Uhuru. And I want to, recognize Comrade Jackson Hollingsworth here in St. Petersburg. We have a great studio audience here tonight. And if you have questions, if you have comments, put them in the chat, or you can raise your hand if you're right here. Go ahead, Jackson.
Yes. I think it's just so amazing how the African People's Socialist Party, Chairman Amalia Shatella, created the African People's Solidarity Committee in 1976 to answer the question of the role of white people in the African Revolution. And to have the strategy and to see that white people can take a stand in true material solidarity with African liberation, and that like you said, Chairwoman Penny, so many white people just stood by or went into drug culture or went off grid or whatever when all of these African revolutionaries were being attacked, were being murdered, were being locked into prisons as political prisoners, had to leave the country, etc. And it's just so incredible that we're having this event tonight, and that that's not going to happen again, that white people are going to take a stand and say not in our name.
Uhuru. I just want to thank Nathan Hatch, who donated tonight, reparations tonight, $50 to the African People's Socialist Party. So I think we're around $550, I think. $555. Uhuru. Woo! That's awesome.
Yes.
Jesse, I just wanted to ask you to talk about, because it wasn't just that only that white people were passive, sat back, but also white people played a direct role in this counterinsurgency against, and still do, against the African population. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Certainly. Well, first of all, I think that was always the case even before the COINTELPRO was officially launched, because as Chairman Amalia Shatella has explained, the state, the white power state, which is that organization of violence that is created to maintain a social system built on slavery, oppression, and exploitation, was born as a white people's state. So our participation as regular white people in state violence against African people has always been there. And in fact, before there was a formal state apparatus in the form of the police and the military and all of that, there was just white people. We were the police.
That's right.
We lynched African people by the thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, in this country at the turn of the century, and we carried out the genocide against the indigenous people. That was counterinsurgency, right there. And even going into the 50s, if you look at all of the murders of the four African girls in the church that you talked about, regular white people did that. Regular white people killed Emmett Till. Regular white people were always part of the counterinsurgency against African people and against the African liberation movement.
Women and men.
Excuse me?
Women and men.
That's right.
Yes, white men and white women were part of that.
And they brought their children.
White children.
Posed them in front of the lifeless, murdered bodies of African people hanging from trees.
Absolutely.
Hideous display of white power and parasitic capitalism and imperialism.
Making up postcards.
And we didn't need J. Edgar Hoover to tell us to do that. We did that because of the material basis of white opportunism, that we were going off of our short-term interests, living on the pedestal and uniting with white power and stepping on the backs of African people to gain our place on the pedestal on the backs of their oppression. And that's why we owe reparations to African people, not just the US government. White people, all white people owe reparations to African people. And reparations to African people is what white people are participating in when we donate, when we contribute to the work, when we turn over the resources to the work of the African People's Socialist Party, Black Star Industries, the Black Power Blueprint. That's reparations even for the lynchings, even for all of the examples of how we carried out the counterinsurgency and the colonial terror and violence against African people. But going into the 1960s, in terms of what you were talking about, it is absolutely true, as you said, that white people were not merely passive, or it's not just that we didn't do anything. We played our role in the counterinsurgency. And first of all, as you were saying, that the 60s was a time when everything was being transformed. Revolution was the main trend throughout the world, and the center of that was the Black Revolution. And everybody around the world acknowledged that, that the center of the revolutionary activity on the whole planet Earth was the Black Power movement inside the United States. And Black revolution inside this country is what radicalized everybody else, including white people. Black power inside the US in the 60s is what brought, as the chairman says, is what brought white women out of the kitchen. It's what brought white homosexuals out of the closet. It is what inspired the women's liberation movement, as it was then called, taking from the Black liberation movement.
Gay liberation movement.
It is what inspired the gay liberation movement, taking its name from the Black liberation movement. And again, Black power was the revolutionary center. So, and many white people, as you said, did support the Black power movement. But when the FBI came in, when the US government came in, when the counterinsurgency began to rear its head and crush the Black power movement, white people abandoned the Black revolution. We didn't just sit by, we abandoned the Black revolution and went on to pursue white rights agendas like free speech on Berkeley, campus, or LSD culture, the right to trip on acid on a commune, or suddenly discovering opposition to the war in Vietnam because so many white people were coming back in body bags. These are all of the causes that white people discovered as the US government was raining terror down upon the Black revolution. And then you had these organizations, these white left organizations. Just to say, what is white left? White left is those political movements which are created by white people who are trying to resolve the contradictions that we have within capitalism, within the social system, on the pedestal, while maintaining the pedestal of the oppression of the national and colonial oppression of African people. That's the white left. It's also the left wing of white power. It's white power. That's what the white left is. It's white power with a red flag, basically. So you have these organizations like Students for Democratic Society and the Weather Underground and these organizations in the 60s that could talk a big game about how radical anti-imperialist they were, but they did not work under the leadership of the Black Revolution. And in fact, organizations like the Weather Underground that engaged in such heroic acts as blowing up fax machines and empty government buildings were actually criticized by the Black Panther Party for adventuristic acts that actually invited more counterinsurgency down upon the Black Power movement in the 60s. That absolutely anarchistic, adventuristic, crazy things that did nothing, that did not serve the interests of the Black Revolution whatsoever. And Fred Hampton, who himself later became a martyr to the counterinsurgency, actually denounced them and called it child's play and folly. And if you want to see how the state that is there to protect white power treats African people versus how it treats white people, look at that time period when you had the African Revolution that was scrambling to try to survive in the face of counterinsurgency, and these ridiculous white leftists that were running around blowing up fax machines in government buildings. And look where the Africans are today, and look where those white leftists are today. The Africans are dead. They're dead. Or they were forced into exile and to live in political asylum like Assad Shakur. The white people didn't spend a day in prison, generally speaking. All of those so-called white radicals, now they're established academics and liberal professors. They didn't spend a day, bombed government buildings, and then went and jumped on trampolines, which was being underground, on some beach house somewhere. And then when they came back from underground, they denounced everything that they did, and imperialism was like, okay, here's a job working at a university. That's the counterinsurgency. And then they start writing all these books, basically ideologically, attempting to ideologically discredit the Black Revolution of the 60s. So now that the Black Revolution has been militarily destroyed, now it's the job of the white left to come in and ideologically discredit it, which is part of counterinsurgency, which is part of COINTELPRO.
Yes.
So this is all part of the counterinsurgency. And again...
And to support neocolonialism, which became a major tactic of the U.S. as African people gained and fought for and died for the right to vote. Then, the U.S. installed African neocolonialists inside the borders of the U.S. to be able to carry out white power and blackface. And we've seen that all the way up to Obama. We've seen the mayors. We've seen, the complicity in carrying out the colonial oppression of African people, the police murders and the mass imprisonment and all of it. And the fact that, as the chairman points out, that African people fought and died to vote, but don't vote.
Yes.
Don't vote because they have nothing to vote for except for in St. Petersburg, Florida, when the Uhuru movement runs candidates. But, otherwise, no. And I just think that just the way that the white left rose up in support of neocolonialism, in support of the criminalization of African people, and in support of the police, in support of, you know, these drugs, never taking a stand around that whatsoever.
Right. Yep.
And basically coming to power because 10 years before that, a white person couldn't have been on city council as a leftist or something like that, as you see in Oakland, California and other places, and supporting gentrification of the African community, which is another form, and basically started in the 1960s with the what was called the urban removal of African people.
Exactly.
Definitely, and I just wanted to say I'm glad that Jackson mentioned that, you know, it was white men and white women, because the whole white feminist movement that really came into a much stronger state during that time period was also part of the counterinsurgency.
Yes.
In fact, Gloria Steinem, the great feminist icon, was a CIA agent.
That's right.
Like, that's not even like she was an agent. Like, she was actually a CIA agent. She openly talks. She brags about it. She brags about it. She's like, yeah, I was a CIA agent. I was hired to infiltrate communist organizations and see what they were up to and report on it to the CIA. So it was, the whole thing was counterinsurgency. That whole white left movement was counterinsurgency. And, you know, I think sometimes there's a mistaken assumption that, you know, you kind of progress from the white left politics into white solidarity with black power, and actually you reject white left politics, and then you embrace white solidarity with black power.
That's right.
Because that's imperialism and counterinsurgency. And what the Uhuru Solidarity Movement, the African People's Solidarity Committee, was created in part to destroy that.
That's right.
To destroy the white left.
Uhuru.
And we're not going to go, it's not going to go down like it did in the 1960s. It's not going to go down like that. And any white leftist that tries to come and unite with the counterinsurgency against African people is going to have to deal with APSC and the Uhuru Solidarity Movement. And we are going to build a human wall between the Black Power movement and this counterinsurgency, this COINTELPRO 2.0 in the form of this campaign against so-called Black Identity Extremists. We're Black Identity Extremists.
Uhuru.
So if the FBI wants to attack Black Identity Extremists, you're going to have to deal with the white Black Identity Extremists first.
Uhuru. Uhuru. Thank you. And I just want to say that we're only $445 short from our goal tonight. There's 89 people on this live stream right now. So if everybody gave $10 that's on to apspuhuru.org/donate, we would definitely make our goal and surpass our goal tonight. And it would be a profound stand of reparations. And, you know, $445, somebody could just give that. That's basically a cheap hotel room in New York City, or, I mean, it's just something that white people spend money on all the time, the weekend vacation and all this sort of thing. And, you know, I want to say that, first of all, it is in our interest as white people to stand in solidarity with African people, to pay reparations, to recognize that the only future that we can have on this planet is an end to white power, which is the violence against the people on the planet Earth and African people inside this country and around the world. And that if we want to live in a world in which there is no oppression, in which all of the ways that we may experience oppression, but still sitting on the pedestal of the oppression of everybody else, so it means that we fought for our rights, as you're talking about, as women, as LGBT, as workers, at the expense of everybody else by maintaining colonialism and, you know, uniting with our own oppressors to maintain this pedestal and white power. But, you know, if we want to see a world in which all oppression is wiped out, that is going to mean the liberation of Africa and African people, which stands against all forms of oppression. And I wanted to, you know, again, call on people, come on, just go ahead and give reparations tonight. Take this stand. You know, this is an opportunity to stand on the forward side of history. And I did want to talk about the Black Star Industries, the program of the African People's Socialist Party. No other organization or movement has something like this, which is, you know, includes Uhuru Foods and Pies and Planet Uhuru and
the commercial kitchen.
Yes, the Jico commercial kitchen here, and that is being built in St. Louis as well. and other programs of the
Community
African People's Socialist Party that is about the political and economic power in the hands of the African working class. It is very, very powerful. The Uhuru Foods and Pies, which a lot of people may recognize out in the Bay Area of California or here in the Tampa Bay area, where every year during the white power holidays, we sell the pies and people can take the struggle for black power home to their family's dinner, and that kind of thing. And, it's a very, very popular, really delicious pies. This is something that's going to be expanded in this upcoming year, especially out in the Bay Area of California. It's going to be built quadrupled beyond what it is doing, and it's been out there since the 1980s. It's a long time tradition. So this is Black Star Industries, the ability of African people to have power over their lives. And one of the most profound and newest and most important of the Black Star Industries is the Black Power Blueprint. So Jackson, do you want to tell us a little bit about the Black Power Blueprint in St. Louis?
Yeah, and St. Louis, African people everywhere, wherever they may be, have a right to self-determination. It's incredibly significant that the African People's Socialist Party is building the Black Power Blueprint in St. Louis as the protest center of the world, as the chairman said, due to the righteous rebellions of the African working class there after the terrible, brutal murder of Mike Brown by Darren Wilson, by the state, by the U.S. government. And so, all of these different organizations, all these white leftist groups, all these neo-colonialist figures and organizations swept in there to try to dissuade this righteous rebellion, and the Uhuru movement is in there. It's the headquarters of the International People's Democratic Uhuru Movement is there, and in these past 3 years has built the African People's Socialist Party has built what no other organization has done. Is building a community center where the black community is being just attacked daily, gentrified, is in just terrible conditions every day. The school system is building a community center there for the community to come together to build self-determination, building an Uhuru Jiko commercial kitchen to build economic development by and in the hands of and for African people there, building a community garden, so building black community control of food, clothing, housing, building an African independence workforce program to provide training and employment to African people, especially those who have been recently incarcerated, upheld as political prisoners by the state, is going to have a marketplace to build commerce for, by, and between African people. And no other organization is doing this. And this is something that the Uhuru movement has done in other places and is really expanding in St. Louis. And it's incredibly significant, as I said, that it's building in St. Louis, and that we as white people need to take a stand in solidarity with this and to pay reparations and to do our part in helping to build these programs for Black Power, for African self-determination, that, as Chairwoman Penny, you stated so clearly, benefits us as well. Because as Chair Jesse pointed out, in the African liberation movement of the 60s, it made it possible for the advances in the, quote, rights of white people, any advances in disability rights and rights for women, LGBT people, all these different sectors of the white community. It was made possible by the Black Power movement. And we have an interest in supporting the Black Power movement and being in true material solidarity, tangible solidarity, reparations, returning the stolen resources that have been stolen for 600 years and are still being stolen today. And you see gentrification just sweeping through, and gentrification and police violence go hand in hand. It's a very violent process, just thieving from the Black community resources, labor, lives, and we owe reparations. So go to APSP, uhuru.org/donate, and pay reparations.
All right, Uhuru, thank you. And yeah, I just really unite with that. And I just think, Jesse, that what deep cynicism of the white society, which is very cynical, which is never take anything too seriously, just always be kind of funny in the face of what the suffering is of African people and the majority of humanity, And we're just supposed to take our lives as a joke and go out to our next vacation or, just enjoy the social wealth that we have that passes down from generation to generation based on enslavement of African people and based on this amassing of wealth, the understanding that an African college graduate has fewer assets than a white high school graduate or even a dropout, a high school dropout in this country. That this two Americas that we're talking about, and we want to, we're making demands. We're building a campaign around that. We're not going to stand by and allow the U.S. government to harm any African person. That it's not just about one police violence incidents. It's about the entire conditions of the violence, of whether it comes down through not having enough food as African people, and they call it, what is that word they use? Food. Well, not just food deserts, but also food insecurity. Food insecurity. I think that's called starvation. Exactly. That exists in every city, in the conditions inside the African community, that we're not going to stand by and watch this violence go down. We're going to take a stand, and I really mean that, because what does it mean to live life? Right. What does it mean to live our whole lives and die for nothing but being a parasite? I don't want to live like that, and that's why so many white people are committing suicide or, self-medicating by blanking everything out with opioids and heroin. And you've seen the films, you've seen the pictures, of white people ODing while their children are in car seats in the back seat. And they're practically, these white people either die or they nearly die and, have no concern for anything except for themselves. And the alcoholism, I mean, I don't want to live like that. This is supposed to be the greatest society. This is supposed to be the greatest civilization on the planet Earth. No. We say no. We want to be part of humanity. And the only way we can do that is take this stand right here, starting inside the borders of the United States. Take responsibility for what we have done, what we have stolen, for what we have stood by and let happen. And we are not going to do that. We are not going to do that. And that we are going to take an active stand, and we're building a whole campaign. We have signs that people can hold. Jesse, tell us about the campaign, the demands, and the work that we want to do. And we also want reparations. And go ahead and go to apspuhuru.org/donate. We need another at least $445 tonight. Just go ahead and give it. Let's give it. Every person who's on here could give $10, and we would more than make it.
Absolutely.
Uhuru.
The first thing you can do if you're white to oppose the FBI's attacks on quote-unquote Black Identity Extremists is go to apspuhuru.org/donate and refuse to be intimidated by the FBI's threats against people like you who want to support Black autonomous social institutions and the right of African people to self-determination. Go donate right now. That's the number one thing you can do to oppose what the FBI is planning to do or is already doing.
For the right of the African People's Socialist Party to function, to exist. It doesn't get money from Soros and all these other things. all of this is through hard work of the institutions and through genuine, heartfelt support and the stand of reparations from white people and hard work of African people to make these buildings, to make all these programs a reality every single day.
Absolutely. There's nothing else like it. There's no other organization that you're going to find anywhere in the world that literally has no puppet master.
Right.
Every other organization is actually serving some other agenda, and you can follow the money. If you follow the money in the Uhuru movement, you find the people. That's where it comes from. It's funded 100% by the people and by reparations to African people. So we are going to be holding a campaign. We're not just doing one event about this. We're going to be holding a whole national, international campaign to mobilize the white community in defense of the Black Revolution, in defense of African self-determination against this counterinsurgent attack by the FBI. And there are signs. If you go to Uhuru Solidarity Movement's Facebook page, you can find the sign that you can print. You'll see pictures of people holding them. Print it out. Take a picture of yourself. It says no to the FBI's targeting of Black movements and stop the FBI designation of Black Identity Extremists. Reparations now.
And let's make that go viral.
Yes.
We want hundreds of thousands of people downloading those signs and taking their pictures. I've seen some powerful ones on Facebook, but we need that to go all over the world. White people everywhere, white people in Africa, settler colonizers, all throughout Europe, in South Africa, white people in Israel, everywhere that white people are, in Australia. It's all the same. It is colonialism, and it is occupiers and being of the oppressor nation.
Exactly.
And if you want to be part of this campaign, we're forming a political action committee of the Uhuru Solidarity Movement. You can email info@uhurusolidarity.org if you're interested in joining the political action committee, because we're going to be doing a lot of things to push back against this attack by the FBI, including making that go viral. We also want to hold demonstrations in front of FBI field offices throughout the United States, a nationally coordinated day of action in front of FBI field offices. And we want to hold events throughout the country where you can bring Chairman Omali Yeshitela and other leaders of the Uhuru movement and the African People's Solidarity Committee as well to come speak about this issue in your city. We know we want to hold events in places like Boston and Oakland and St. Louis, and of course right here in St. Petersburg, Florida. But if you're out there and you want to hold an event as well, get in touch with us at info@uhurusolidarity.org and participate in this campaign. Participate in bringing in the chairman, participate in holding these days of action, and even doing things like going to city council, bringing resolutions before city council, calling for your local city government to refuse to collaborate with the FBI's attacks, with the FBI's criminalization of the Black Liberation Movement. And again, last but not least, is reparations to African people. That will be a goal of this campaign itself, is to raise reparations in the form of money, material solidarity to the African People's Socialist Party, to the right of African people to have self-government, and specifically to this amazing new front of the party's work to build self-government in the form of the Black Power Blueprint. These are all some of the goals of this campaign, and again, we encourage you to join this committee, become active in building this committee. This is not going to be just a 1 week long thing. We want to build this for the rest of the year or however long it takes, to build this campaign. And again, you can email info@uhurusolidarity.org.
Do we have any questions online or in the chat? Any questions that people want to raise, or anybody here?
I have
Want
a
to ask
question
us?
about, could you talk a bit about the split in SNCC and the white people in SNCC and what they did in the 60s and 70s?
Well, in 1966, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee met, and which had basically started to coordinate the protests, the sit-ins at cafes and restaurants and other places throughout the South, to just be able to have the right of African people to go into a business and get served to eat. And that was life-threatening just to carry those demonstrations out. The great Ella Baker, the African woman who led the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, founded this organization to coordinate all of these struggles and protests throughout the South. And so so as the struggle of African people transformed, as Chairman Omali Shatella has summed up, from a struggle for civil rights and democratic rights to become an anti-colonial struggle as the urban rebellions and the struggle for Black power, which really marked it as more than just a struggle for the vote or something like that. In fact, African people were granted the right to vote by the U.S. government, but that didn't stop the rebellions in Watts and Detroit and every place else, because it became clear that African people were a colony inside the U.S. and were fighting for liberation and were the revolutionary force, as you said, the revolutionary center inside the borders of the U.S. So a struggle came up in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which at that time was the leading organization. It was at that time that the Black Panther Party was also forming, and so, a different consciousness, and as we said, anti-colonial consciousness was coming to and growing inside of the African Revolution. And so SNCC came together and voted to expel all the white members that it had and called on white people to go back into the white community to organize other white people against white power and to stand in solidarity with the struggle of SNCC. And white people were kicked out of. You should read some of the history of this, where white people cried and they were hurt that this happened. Their feelings were hurt, and etc. White people went back into white society, but did not organize other white people to take this stand. In fact, it's at that time where white people discovered that they were against the war in Vietnam and did not want to be drafted to go to Vietnam to be, come back in a body bag, but through the struggle of the victorious and heroic Vietnamese people. And so, it just really exposed that without the leadership, the direct leadership of the African working class, we as white people were never going to take that principled stand on our own, because we are opportunists. We sit on this pedestal. We never come to the conclusion that, that we should be under the leadership of African people in order to take a revolutionary stand. We just go about our own agenda, which is opportunist, which serves ourselves only at the expense of African people. So 10 years after that struggle inside of SNCC and what was called the Vine City Paper, written in Atlanta, Georgia, expelling white people from SNCC, the African People's Socialist Party created in 1976 the African People's Solidarity Committee under their direct leadership, under the leadership of African internationalism, with the mandate to go inside of the white community to organize other white people to join the Solidarity Movement and to pay reparations to African people. And we do have a really important question here.
Can people from outside the U.S. join? This is from Gabrielle
in Poland.
Lucifer. Yes.
What country could he say? Where, I don't know. He's from Poland. Okay,
from
so
Poland. Yes, please join.
We had an African People's Solidarity Day in Poland.
In Warsaw.
In Warsaw one
yes,
year.
We did. Yes,
and
we
you
did.
could help continue that tradition, Gabrielle.
Absolutely.
So yes, absolutely. Go to. Please give the address.
You can join the Uhuru Solidarity Movement by going to uhurusolidarity.org. I'm sure somebody will post it in the comments there. UHURU solidarity.org and uhurusolidarity.org/join-USM. That's the full URL. Somebody will put it in there. If you go to uhurusolidarity.org, you'll see a thing that says become a member. You can become a sustainer, you can become a general member, and you can join from anywhere on the planet Earth. And you can build wherever you're located. Like Penny said, we can keep the Uhuru movement alive in Warsaw.
And also, we want to call on, again, everybody. Now there's over 70, there's almost 80 people on right now. If every single person gave $10, we would far surpass our goal. That would be a powerful stand of reparations tonight. Or somebody could give $445, which we still need to raise. And I know that we will. I just really want to thank and acknowledge all the comrades and friends who have given reparations tonight and we will make our goal of $1,000.
Uhuru.
So do we have more
No.
questions, or?
Not yet,
no?
but Gabrielle was very excited, so we look forward to
All
working
right,
with you.
Uhuru. Uhuru means
Uhuru.
freedom. All right, any other questions? Any other things that anybody wants to raise? All right, so, just to say that we want to thank everybody for participating in this. This is the launch of a campaign, as Jesse said. We're going to be out there going from town to town.
Yes.
We're going to be in St. Louis. We're going to be in Oakland,
Yes.
in the next few weeks. And even, hopefully Chairman O'Malley Chatella is going to be there as well to be able to talk about this critical thing. And you think about in Oakland where, the COINTELPRO, that was the headquarters of the Black Panther Party, and what they did to Huey Newton and, to the leaders of the Black Panther Party to destroy it, to criminalize it, and, do everything it could to destroy this incredible movement there in Oakland, which was one of the very first places that the U.S. government brought crack cocaine into that very deeply impoverished African community. And now we see almost total gentrification in a city that was once predominantly African, Mexican, and indigenous is now white. It's now white. And part of taking a stand is struggling against this brutal violence of gentrification against African people that is pushing them out into deeper and deeper poverty. So, we want to thank everybody for coming out tonight, for participating, and to say that you can continue to go to apspuhuru.org/donate. Many people go after the event and continue to give. And, we just want to salute all of you that were here. We want you to join at, say the name again?
UhuruSolidarity.org.
UhuruSolidarity.org. Take a stand. Download your sign that says white people say no to the FBI attacks under Black Identity Extremists against African organizations. Stand in solidarity with the liberation of African people. And we want to say unity through
reparations!
Uhuru!
Uhuru!